to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started with our discussion. So please hold tight for just a minute or two and we'll get going very shortly. All right, so for those who have just joined us, welcome, good morning or good evening, depending on whether you're calling in from the United States or Asia. We're delighted to have you with us today. We're going to give everyone a minute or two to come in from the waiting room and we'll get started very shortly. I see we're still getting a lot of people trickling in every moment, so we'll probably give it another 30 seconds or so. All right, so I see that things are starting to slow down with people joining the room. So I'll go ahead and get us going so that we have as much discussion as possible today. As all of you know, you're here with the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program for a discussion between our program director, Brian Eiler, and journalist Abby Seif, who has just recently published Troubling the Water, looking at Cambodia's Tonle Sap Lake. So I'm just going to give a very brief logistical note before we get started, and then I'll turn things over to Brian and Abby for their discussion. So we are going to have live interpretation available today into Khmer language. So if you would like to listen in Khmer, please go ahead and look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little globe labeled interpretation. If you click that, you can go into the Khmer audio room and you should be able to hear translation into Khmer from our erstwhile interpreter. Throughout today's discussion, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box in the Zoom function, which again is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It looks like 2 chat bubbles, and you could submit any questions, whether they're minor technical difficulties or you have a question for Abby and Brian, please submit them there. I will be watching the Q&A box to help keep things flowing smoothly throughout the discussion. And then when Brian and Abby finish their conversation, then we'll turn over to the audience for live Q&A. So with that note on logistics, I think we're ready to get started. So please go ahead and go into the interpretation room if you would like to use Khmer interpretation. And Brian, I will turn things over to you for a substantive discussion.
Thank you, Courtney. And just one last reminder, if you're calling in from Cambodia and you would like to listen to today's talk in Khmer language, then please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom app and join the Khmer language room. So it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. My name is Brian Eiler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program. And many of you know that our program takes a great interest in the conservation and the protection of the world's most productive river, the Mekong River. The Mekong is responsible for 20% of the world's freshwater fish catch and is one of the most agriculturally productive river basins in the world, underpinning the economic security of more than 70 million people in the basin and the countries that use and utilize the resources of the Mekong Basin. Today, we're going to talk about the beating heart of the Mekong, the Tonle Sap Lake. It's probably the Mekong's most unique feature because it really does serve as a beating heart with its annual expansion and contraction that drives and makes the Mekong the world's most productive river system. We're going to take a deep dive into the challenges and threats to the Tonle Sap through looking at life on the ground, if you will, or on the water, as it is described in Abby Seif's excellent book, Troubling the Water. This book came out earlier this year, and we're just really delighted to have Abby here with us to go through a conversation for about a half an hour on her book and how it came together and what she found in the course of conducting research for this book. Abby Seif is a journalist and she spent a lot of time in the Mekong. She worked for the Cambodia Daily in Phnom Penh for about 4 years when she conducted a lot of the research for this book. She's now based in New York City and is out and telling the world about the importance of the Tonle Sap Lake. So Abby, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Great book, great read. I've read it through cover to cover twice already. Really looking forward to having this conversation. Welcome, Abby.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. And thanks to Courtney and Adrian and Tita as well for interpreting. I will try to speak slowly.
Great. Well, hey, let's kick things off. We're going to have a conversation here for about a half an hour, and I've got some questions for you that will help us better understand what's happening in the Tonle Sap. But, you know, many of us might not know about the Tonle Sap Lake. Tell us about the Tonle Sap and why it's a unique part of the world.
Sure. Well, as you said before, it's a really unique phenomenon, part of the Mekong. And you referred to the beating heart. So just as a little geographical overview, the Mekong River goes from China to Vietnam, as I think we probably all know, and there's many tributary rivers. And one of the key tributary rivers is Cambodia's Tonle Sap River, which stretches up right at the conflux of Phnom Penh. It stretches up to the Tonle Sap Lake. And what happens with this river is twice a year it reverses course. So as water overflows the Mekong, it pushes up into the Tonle Sap Lake, which then expands, I believe, up to 6 times its dry season size. And then as water flows out, the lake shrinks back in and the water goes back up into the Mekong. And that's not just cool and interesting, but it also allows for this incredible amount of biodiversity. So this means that, you know, these really rare species of fish like the Mekong giant catfish, which travel hundreds of miles to spawn, can move along these rivers and up into the upper Mekong. It also means that a lot of nutrient-rich silt, which is really critical for the paddy rice around the floodplains of the Tonle Sap, can get pushed out into the lake. And it also just creates this vast fishery for, that millions of Cambodians rely on directly and millions more rely on indirectly. And yeah, it's really special. It's special culturally and it's special not just economically, but there's all these critical kind of ties related to the lake.
Can you run us through kind of what's the magnitude of water that we're talking about? How do we understand this expansion? What amount of Cambodia gets covered? Is it deep? Is this annual expansion? Help us better understand.
Yeah.
What it looks like.
So I mean, it's sort of like if you look at a satellite image from above, during the wet season, it really seems like Cambodia is being swallowed by this ocean. In the middle of the lake, it can get quite deep. I want to say up to 70 feet. But most of it, it's very shallow. You know, it's a paddy field, so we're talking about the ankle and knee height. But it's absolutely prodigious. It can expand up to 6,000 square miles. I think it's about the size of Fiji at its biggest. And so it's just, it's kind of remarkable to see, even if when you're in the middle, it will just look like, a flooded paddy field.
Wow. Well, most of us listening into this book talk are foreigners, although we do have some callers in from Cambodia listening to the Khmer interpretation. And, some of us are probably hearing about the uniqueness and the mightiness of the Tonle Sap Lake for the first time. One of the things I found really fascinating about your book was when reading through it, you provide numerous perspectives of other foreigners who encounter the lake for the first time. And these aren't people who are looking at it in the 20th century. You go back like 10 centuries and give us 10 centuries worth of foreigners looking at the lake. Can you tell us about that process of finding the words of like the Chinese emissaries that went there 10 centuries ago, the Europeans and the American colonialists who made their way to the Tonle Sap? how did you find this material and how did they see the lake?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most fun parts. I had done quite a bit of field reporting on the lake. And then I kind of was curious to see how it was described historically. The first one is Jules de Gaulle, who is very well known because it was the first outsider's account of Cambodia. And this was written in 1296, really old. And this is kind of like a well-known text because of that historical phenomenon. But Zhu just speaks about, the water coming and covering everything, and he's in complete awe, talking about the variety of fish and the way that people are catching it and the size of them. And then I was kind of curious what other descriptions were out there, and it turns out that almost everybody who has visited Cambodia as a colonialist, as an explorer over the centuries, anybody who makes it up to the Tonle Sap region writes about the lake because it is really astonishing, and they've sort of never seen something like this. So they talk about, these villages that are floating with the lakes, and they talk about the lake rising to submerge the trees, and they talk about people leaving their homes and walking down the bank and bringing just a small, like a rattan basket, and scooping the water and having enough fish for their supper. These are so striking because you can kind of see the awe in these descriptions, but also because, some of that is still the case now, or at least has been the case in recent memory. So a lot of what they were describing was not dissimilar from what the fishers themselves were telling me about. They would say, let's say somebody in their 50s, oh, when I was a kid, we could ride the boat and there were so many fish, they would jump into the boat, or I could just take a basket like this and scoop it in the water and catch fish. And this is not hyperbole, this is not that long ago. This is in recent memory. So it was just an interesting through line, what this fishery had been for so many millennia, really.
Wow. And just a question about the sources themselves. Did you have to look for them in their original language and then translate them? Or how accessible are these sources?
No, I mean, fortunately for me, who is very bad at language, quite a number of these are in English and have been translated by excellent translators. There are probably other texts out there that haven't been translated. This is not a comprehensive academic review by any means. It was more like I was seeking out these books and seeing if I could find descriptions and putting them in when they seemed apt. But I'm sure there were a lot of, obviously there was French colonialism before that. The Portuguese were in Cambodia. There's a long history of outside meddling. So I'm sure there's many more descriptions in other languages.
Good. I'm glad you framed it that way. And for the history buffs out there who are interested in learning more about, how foreigners, the outsiders looked at the Tonle Sap, we're going to talk about how the people of Tonle Sap see the Tonle Sap soon. But for those of you who are interested in this outside view, Abby's bibliography, provides everything you need to get started on that in the book. So Abby, your book is partly a study of how this impressive miracle of nature, we often describe the expansion and contraction of the Tonle Sap and everything that comes from it as a miracle of the Mekong or a miracle of nature. This has fed the people of Cambodia for millennia. And your book also paints a picture of how the lake's heartbeat weaves the very fabric of Cambodia, from the Angkor Empire's rise and then potentially its fall, to annual boat races in Phnom Penh on the Tonle Sap River, to the very essentials of Khmer cuisine. And each of these strings of Cambodian culture and history is tied to the Tonle Sap Lake. And I think you bring that together very clearly in your book, as well as being tied to the Mekong River, since the Tonle Sap is tied to the Mekong. Interestingly, in your book, you talk about pulling one thread and the fabric of the Tonle Sap and perhaps of Cambodian culture unravels. And you say that we, as it turns out, we being humans, are pulling the threads all at once. Can you take us deeper into how the lake is unraveling?
Sure. So to me, there's kind of three overarching ways that the lake is being hit. We can think of them as sort of global, regional, and local. But at the highest level, we have climate change. And so because of climate change, I mean, I suppose we can't say this definitively, but it's sort of widely understood. There's the droughts in Cambodia are just becoming much worse, higher highs, lower lows. So worse droughts, worse flash floods. But in the case of the lake, we're really talking about the impact of worsening droughts. And so that means we're seeing much lower, this is contributing to much lower Mekong river levels, which in turn leads to much lower Tonle Sap river levels, and a lot less water is flowing into the lake. I think, 2 years ago, there was just a quarter of the lake's volume. And so that's the global problem. That's something, we're all in that together, but countries like Cambodia, which are just really particularly vulnerable to climate change, even though they are not the prime contributors, are really suffering from that. And that situation will only get worse without concerted international action. Then the next level, which you could speak to much better than I could, is of course the hydropower dams on the upper and lower Mekong. And so we know that in China on the Lansing, there's 11 dams. There's 2 in Laos. There's more in discussion and being for construction. And then there's tons on the tributaries as well, which really can't be ignored because, obviously the main stem dams are really critical, but the tributary dams like the lower Sezon 2 in Cambodia, that has a huge impact on fish migration. And so that's another hit to the fisheries. It changes the river hydrology for better or for worse. And we can go into that more. But it's quite clear that, because of the change in hydrology, which is necessary to bring electricity, that changes kind of the natural way that the river moves in and out of the lake. And then
if I could just add in before you move to the local issue, is that those first two impacts that you talk about, the global and the more upstream impacts of dams, they're happening at the same time. It's the drought. I think people often think the drought happens in dry times. The Mekong goes through this dry season and wet season transition each year. And during the dry season, the lake contracts, and during the wet season, the lake expands. So often we associate drought with dry season effects. But in fact, it's the drought's happening during the wet season, and that's driving the flows to be lower. A lack of rain is making the flow of the Mekong lower during the wet season, and therefore the heartbeat just isn't expanding as much. So I was talking with some Mekong watchers the other day about this. It's really hard to convince people that drought is happening during a time when there's lots of rain, right? But that is indeed what's happening. And the upstream dams are taking water out of the system during the wet season and putting it back in during the dry season. So when there's less rain during the wet season and upstream dams are taking water out, then that's reducing the effect of the heartbeat much more. So, we can get back to this during discussion, but it's kind of hard to wrap your head around how drought can occur during the wet season when there's still a lot of rain happening. But back to you for local.
No, that's great that you clarified. And we should also say that, these problems are happening in concert and,
right.
Making the situation worse. So the third major issue is overfishing and illegal fishing. And that's the kind of hyper-local problem. And that's, it's kind of a negative feedback loop where we have a lot of small scale fishers. These are really, poor family fishers who are not making money off of fishing, but just fishing for the table or for a very small income. And because there are fewer and fewer fish in the lake, they feel that they have to resort to illegal methods. And when I say illegal, this is anything from using a net where the holes are too small to kind of more active things like using electricity, battery powered. You put it in, it kills the fish. But even things like, cutting sticks from protected forests to create areas to tie your net on, or using a longer than usual net. And these are all illegal. I would argue, based on what I have heard from every fisher living on the lake, as well as NGOs and activists, that there's a bigger problem, which is not very well discussed or addressed. And even I don't know the contours of it, but large scale illegal fishing. And that's happening, deep in the lake in areas that are meant to be protected. And that's likely, really contributing to the devastation of fish stocks. And just all of these things are working in concert, where it just gets worse and worse. The fishermen, are using smaller nets. Because they're using smaller nets, this means that juvenile fish are being caught more often. They're not growing bigger. That means there's no bigger fish. I mean, it's a trifecta of problems.
And a vicious cycle that's playing out.
Absolutely.
With the people that have thrived on the lake for so long, I had heard that the population moving to the lakeside had been increasing over the last decade before this period of environmental crisis really started to set in, which is rare, right? In this day and age, we often see rural to urban migration, particularly in Cambodia, and the pressures to absorb migrant labor in Phnom Penh and the other rising urban areas in Cambodia. But the lakes populations were increasing. That still might be happening. There's a lot that we don't know about the lake. I think that's worth looking into. But your travels around the lake, they gather the stories of people, and they tell the stories of people. Particularly, you place a lot of emphasis on telling the stories of women who rely on the lake's resources for their livelihood. These people once thrived, but now they're really going through some tough times, almost blow after blow, living through this vicious cycle of change. And in those stories, for me, that's what really served as a unique contribution to the literature and the ongoing discussion of the Mekong. But two, it really made the book hit home for me. Can you tell us about some of the people that we meet in the book?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the way the book turned out, I had wanted to go back and do more reporting. Most of that reporting I did in 2016, 2017, and a little in 2018, when I was still living in Cambodia. And I had always hoped to go back and see these people again. And because of COVID, that wasn't possible. And so unfortunately, I haven't stayed in touch, but a few people I did visit multiple times, and I've always said Cambodia is one of the greatest places to work as a reporter, because people are very open and they're very willing to talk with you. And everyone I spoke with was so aware of these problems, and often they would say it's dams in Lao or it's climate change. But yeah, I mean, so I think I started the book with this woman, Ching Lam, who lives along Prek Tol, which is a protected wildlife area in the very north of the lake. And she was a Khmer Rouge survivor. She had lost her husband and some of her children, and she remarried at a certain point. She moved to this area. I mean, she's really a microcosm of, she worked as a migrant laborer in Thailand for a while, sort of everything that many Cambodians go through, she has been through. And she was, I met her the first time in 2016. I went because there were a bunch of forest fires right in that area. And so there were still, fires burning in the distance. But she had already begun replanting her garden. She had this beautiful garden. She grew pumpkins, she grew chilies. And the fires had just, come through weeks before and sort of were still smoldering. And she had this attitude of like, I just have to push forward and control what I can control. And she walked us around and she showed us everything. But yeah, you meet people like this, and it's very frustrating because it's like she is doing everything right, and she's her whole community put out this fire together, and she's still growing things, and they're still trying to fish, and they're very in that community in particular, they're very against illegal fishing, and they're very keen to say we don't use those methods. We really believe in protecting these fish, but there's so much that's not in their control. And then I tried to go back to some of the same villages. So I also spent time in kind of some of the stilted villages in the north of Siem Reap, not the north of Siem Reap, the north of the lake in Siem Reap.
And Abby, when you say stilted village, what can you describe?
Yeah, I should describe that. So there are a few different types of villages. There's a village like Praktol is it's on a small riverway leading off of the lake. And those are homes that are on the riverbank and kind of stay on the riverbank. There are floating villages like Kampong Prek was a small floating village I went to, which is in Persat province in the south. And those are, boats and floating houses, and they move inland with, as the water moves, the boats have to follow the water, kind of hugging the shore as it were, but they are floating. And then there's these stilt villages, which they are at the edge of the lake. There are these houses that are on, 20 feet high stilts, long wood poles, and in the dry season, you climb up a lot of stairs to reach them. But in the wet season, that's where the lake moves in. And so the water just rises right under the home, all the way up to the porch, and everything below, which previously these were real roads. You can drive cars down them. They're huge. In the wet season, you can only move boats down them, and it's like Venice. You travel everywhere by boat. It's pretty remarkable to see. It's a popular tourist attraction. And yeah, so those villages, they tend to be close to cities. And so people can, you'll often meet people who, I'm a fisherman, but I also drive a tuk-tuk. But you also just see so much debt there and so much migration. Their kids are really flooding out, like kids anywhere in rural areas going to work in factories, going across the border to Thailand, because there's just, whereas you could make a decent living being in one of these villages and driving your boat out to fish every day in the fishing season, that's just not viable anymore.
I'm glad you brought up debt, because it's something that I'm very much concerned about as these fish catches decrease year on year. But yet there's the anticipation that the fisheries might recover, so I can borrow now and pay back later if I have a boom in fisheries. How do you see the debt problem creeping up in these villages, and how are fishers there coping with it?
I mean, the debt problem is just, it's unsustainable. Say it's unsustainable is to put it mildly. It's again, a lot of the reporting I was doing was years ago. And so that was before COVID. It's must just have only gotten worse and worse. But what I was seeing was basically what happens is, let's say you're a fisherman, you have a certain amount of expenses every year, which might be new nets, it might be shrimp traps, just your daily living. So it's very common to take out microfinance loans to cover these costs, thinking that you need the money for it, but hopefully you will earn enough during the fishing season that you can pay it back. In 2016, that was this horrific drought, the forest fires, and the fish catch was very, very low. So everybody was deeply in debt. And the next year was an okay year. So people did a bit better. They might have been able to pay it back. But every year subsequently has just been worse and worse and worse. It's been a drought year. The fish catch has gone down, at least anecdotally. And what happens is people take out microfinance loans, and then to pay back the microfinance loan, they might take another one, or they might, this guy I met in 2016, he sort of pointed out in his village, everyone who had debt, which was everyone in the village. And then he said, that guy over there is really smart because he took out a microfinance loan and is using it to loan to the neighbors at a higher rate. And everyone has microfinance loans, but then they also take these more casual loans from neighbors because, let's say your kid gets sick and you have to take them to a health clinic. You need money right then. And so then there's a secondary debt. And because of all the debt, that's really a driving force for people going to work in construction sites, people going to work in garment factories.
Or people leaving the country to work in Thailand too.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a need for regulation. We think about debt, that's something that can be regulated, and other options can be provided to provide relief. Cambodia's governance toolbox, it's not very robust, and there are not resources that, say, welfare-based resources that can be distributed to those who are affected to this. But this year, Prime Minister Hun Sen he's cracked down on illegal fishing and other damaging practices to land use around the lake. We follow this closely, and we also follow how Cambodia's COP26 commitments have made a promise to build no more mainstream Mekong dams on its stretch of the Mekong. So how should we see this? Should we see this as a kind of ray of hope for the future of the Tonle Sap? Should we apply some caution when interpreting these signals?
Yeah, I do think it's hopeful in some ways. It shows that the government recognizes the importance of the lake and the Mekong, and some of it is Cambodia has fantastic laws on the book, and so much of the Tonle Sap has been a protected area all along. So with a lot of this, it's for instance, you mentioned the land around the lake, and just to fill people in. Basically, and since the forest fires, so in the last 5 years, I guess, there's been a kind of large-scale deforestation of the flooded forests in the north of the lake, and it's being turned into farmland, which is rented out as parcels for ordinary farmers. And just a few months ago, Prime Minister Hun Sen announced a crackdown, and they were going to, restore this flooded forest. And they say, they're going after the people who cut it down in the first place, which are big people, they're powerful people, they're local officials. You can't get away with that as an ordinary farmer. But how did it get to, this has been happening in plain view for years and years and years.
Right.
It's very hard to restore a forest once it's cut down, especially a flooded forest.
And how do you restore it? What do you restore it with?
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know where you begin with that. And then, it's similar with the fisheries. It's great that they're cracking down. They did a similar crackdown, I want to say 2017, task force, helicopters, the whole 9 yards. This many people arrested, this many nets destroyed, but then we didn't really hear anything about it afterwards. And I really wonder, like, who are the people being arrested? And I was trying to look up some articles on that before I jumped on this call, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about pretty low level or even middle level people who are being arrested, because it's the same issue in America. It's not unique to Cambodia. Those are the easy arrests to get. You can get a lot of numbers, but we need to look at who's behind kind of the more systemic problems. And it's not just the Tonle Sap, it's like what we see in, particularly in Cambodia's protected forests, where there's been huge deforestation, illegal logging by powerful individuals. This is very well covered in local media. Those people are rarely taken to task. So to my mind, it's a good sign, because it shows that it's important and that the government cares, but it really feels like, unless there's a concerted anti-corruption effort to go hand in hand with this, I don't know if that's enough. I suppose the other possibility is, if there's, like you mentioned, support or social supports. And that's what many of the fishers I spoke to said they wanted. They said, if we could get some land to farm, or if we could get some alternative vocations, things to do, that also takes some of the pressure off the fisheries, gives it a chance to recover if illegal fishing is stopped. So I don't think it's totally hopeless. And there's things like that. Is it the Wonders of the Mekong project that has just released a bunch of endangered fish species that have been raised from juveniles back into the lake. And so that shows that there's some belief that, like, the lake can support this, and that the system, but I want to be optimistic, but as I think many of us who have watched this happen in Cambodia over and over, it's hard to know if the if the political will really is there.
Right. And I think it's interesting. You look at the years when these crackdowns occur. They're always in a year of either a communal or a national election.
Right,
so
this year, an election this year.
Yeah, there's a communal election
but
in June. So you're trading, it's kind of trading more fish for more votes. Promising more fish, you get more votes, and it's a common political play that the ruling party has used for decades. I write about it in my book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, about Hun Sen's relationship with the Mekong, relationship with the Tonle Sap Lake, and trace those particular events as a political choice for Hun Sen, the one that has apparently paid off for him. Hey, let's move to our Q&A. This has been a great discussion. And if any of you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box for Abby. I am going to go to the Q&A box, and Abby, I'm going to let you know who's asking the questions and ask you to give a brief answer so we can get through a lot of them.
Could we also,
go ahead, Abby, sure.
Well, if you want to ask a question in Khmer, maybe you could ask it in the Khmer channel and Tita could interpret it.
Right, or rather, if you are listening in Khmer language, write your question in Khmer into the Q&A box, and we'll have it translated. I think that's a good way to make it work.
That's smarter. Thank you.
All right, so let's start off with our first question from Wenjing Man. Wenjing says, Abby, I read your interview article on your book with Sebastian Strangio and The Diplomat, and you mentioned over the last years, major investment resources have been poured in, poured into the Tonle Sap, including governance, management, conservation, livelihoods, etc. So given current developments from the highest level in terms of actions against land encroachment, I do see this as a more positive sign. Perhaps we've answered that question, but do you have anything to follow up on with that?
I don't, I need to look over my interview because I don't feel that there have been major investments poured in, certainly not in terms of livelihoods. I think, you know, that's the kind of thing people wanted to see, but I haven't, you know, I've seen a few ad hoc projects here and there, and these types of task force that we're talking about now. But unfortunately, I don't think I've really seen major investments poured in. And I do think if we saw that kind of thing, it might be a reason to be a little more hopeful. And maybe that's what we're seeing now. I mean, maybe I should be optimistic about.
Well, let's see. Let's keep watching. Here's a question from Sang Sukia. Abby, do you have any statistics about the current fish population in the lake compared to the last few years, or how fisheries are declining or changing?
I don't offhand, but there was a very good article recently in VOA by Sukmono Chan, where she looked at fish yields, and they are not the overall fish yields, which they don't break apart the lake from other freshwater fisheries. So it's just freshwater fisheries. They're not significantly going down year over year, but what we're seeing is because there's more fishermen relying on it, individual yields are going down a lot. And it's also hard to take what an individual, not everything is counted because they're mostly looking at industrial fishing and not individual. And kind of the dearth of statistics around this is what makes it very difficult. So much of what we're talking about is fairly anecdotal. But you can look at things that are recorded every year, like the dive fisheries during prahok season. That's always a good measure, or when the price of prahok rises, which it has been doing. And there's a lot of good local reporting around that. But off the top of my head, I couldn't say. It's around 450,000 tons of fish pulled from freshwater fisheries each year. And that's been fairly steady for the last decade or so.
Well, Abby, you mentioned prahok, which is everyone's favorite Tonle Sap food, but we haven't talked about it yet. What is prahok and why is it so important?
Yeah, so prahok is, you see this in every Mekong country. They have a version of this, but it's a fermented fish paste. It can be sort of very thin and watery and just used as a seasoning, or it can be kind of richer and used as a main course, but it's made out of a fish called tre rio, which is a type of cyprinid. Am I saying that word right? And so it's these very small, very oily fish, which means they're really nutrient rich. And they are the most common fish that you will find in the Mekong. Every fishing community really relies on these fish. Even going back to Angkorian times, you know, this is the type of fish you are finding in pre-Angkorian graves. So this fish, you catch it by the ton and you clean it and you salt it and you leave it to ferment for a number of weeks or months, and then it's this absolute staple fish paste. I mean, prahok and rice, like these are two quintessential staples, and prahok is very, it's really nutritious, and it's like a kind of key source of protein and nutrients, particularly for the poorest of Cambodians.
So I'm glad you mentioned the price of Prahok is a kind of a proxy for scarcity of tray reel. And if tray reel are scarce, then there are some assumptions that the rest of the fisheries population of the Tonle Sap is suffering. But I think importantly, you also hit on the fact that we really don't know. That's the issue. We really don't know how, there's not good science yet, or not good data on the state of the Tonle Sap fishery. And I think the data that comes out of the Cambodian government is often altered or often changed for political purposes. So there are reasons not to necessarily believe that wholesale, but it is also, it could be it could serve as a benchmark indicator for something. But we should always, read that with caution when we read it. So there is need for good kind of independent research that's verified and done in a very objective manner on the state of the Tonle Sap fishery. I'm going to go to a comment from, well, it disappeared, but a consummate Mekong watcher, David Blake, let me see if I could find it, mentioned in a good comment that drought is not a simple phenomenon, but it's often used as a generic term. And sometimes we have to be clear about what sort of drought is happening, whether it's a hydrological drought, a meteorological drought, agricultural drought, or economic drought. And, it's possible for all four of these to be happening together at the same time in certain parts of Cambodia. But he feels that he suspects that you're mostly referring to the first two kinds, the hydrological drought and meteorological drought in the book. But the other two, agricultural and economic, are relevant and often more localized, tending to impact poorer households even more. Any comment to that?
No, I mean, I think that's really accurate and fair, and we can't, again, we don't want to pinpoint one particular thing. We need to understand that all of these issues work in concert and be really holistic with responses as well. For instance, agricultural drought, that's a perfect case in point, because almost every fisher that I spoke with said, what we really want is we want to move to land. They're very envious of farmers. There's a sense that that's farmers stable. And of course, in some ways, yes, you have land, which is collateral, which is valuable, but farmers are really suffering in Cambodia, and especially farming land around the Tonle Sap because of these same issues, because the lake is not expanding as much. And so if there was some mass effort, let's say, to move people off the lake, give them land, are you just dropping them in a new type of drought? So I think that's a great point.
So another question comes from Chen Chi Huang, who says, are there still mainly ethnic Vietnamese people living in the lake area? Do they now have full citizenship rights? And you talk about this in the book. I think there's an entire chapter dedicated to the Vietnamese people living mostly in floating villages in the lake.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. So for those who don't know, there's a really significant ethnic Vietnamese population in Cambodia. It's, again, hard to get precise statistics, but about 700,000 to 1 million. And most of them are stateless, so they don't have Vietnamese citizenship, and they don't have Cambodian citizenship, even though many, a really large portion of this group has been in Cambodia for generations, since long before the Khmer Rouge era. And they lack paperwork and they lack identification, and so they're not considered, they don't have the full rights of Cambodian citizens. And because of this, they have a big portion have often lived in fishing communities on the Tonle Sap, also on the Mekong, and at the outskirts of Phnom Penh. And they live there because they have no rights to own land. And this community, you can read the French colonialists talk about these communities, the Annamites who travel up into the Tonle Sap every year. So these communities have been there for centuries, and they tend to be, they're really common scapegoats. So even today, when we see some of the rhetoric around who is doing illegal fishing in the lake, powerful people are saying, oh, it's the Vietnamese, it's the Vietnamese. And I'm sure, yeah, like we talked about the small fishers, I'm sure a number of those fishers are ethnic Vietnamese, but there's not a concerted, systemic, there, again, this is a community that's really widely used as a scapegoat for all sorts of problems within Cambodia. What was the second part of the question? If they have
have they been given rights, citizenship rights or land rights?
No, I mean, occasionally, like, individuals are able to obtain that, but certainly not on a collective scale.
And a persistent issue. We can only imagine that this issue becomes more intensified as the resources deplete of the Tonle Sap. Election politics also come to play in election years, as the Vietnamese ethnic peoples are often utilized as scapegoats. So it's and I really appreciate your reporting of this issue that's often not discussed kind of in the larger Mekong discourse. Or even the political discourse or regional discourse in the Mekong, and perhaps more can be drawn to it. So here I'm going to combine a question from Thomas Cristofoletti and Michael Buckley on the new on announcements about a new dam on the mainstream of the Mekong in Cambodia, despite a past moratorium that said no new Mekong dams on the mainstream Mekong till 2030, and then the COP26 commitments from Environmental Minister Sai Samal. Last week, we learned about a study being done on the massive 1.4 gigawatt Stung Treng Dam in northern Cambodia. What might be happening there? And does this go against promises made by the Cambodian government authorities?
I have a feeling you can answer this much better than I can, Brian.
I've got as many questions as you do.
Yeah, I mean, this is just for background. This dam at Stung Treng has been bounced around since the 60s. This is always seen as like a really key location for a dam. And then in the last, I guess, 10 years, as they were making the Lower Saison 2, there was a lot of talk of this Stung Treng Dam again. They would do research for a while, they would stop researching for a while. So, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, if this means it's really happening or if this is just I don't know.
Right. A question worthy of further discussion. It's possible to do studies on a dam and if there's an intent to build it, but the studies and everything is ready to go, and the stroke of midnight on January 1st, 2030, the dam breaks ground, which would be a really unfortunate outcome for the Mekong.
I mean, my understanding is that's no longer a very good location for a dam because of everything that's happening upstream.
Right, and also because of the understanding that there's a broad understanding, I think, within the Cambodian government of the importance of protecting the Tonle Sap Lake, and then the impact of that dam could have on the Tonle Sap Lake. Thus, the two decisions, the public decisions, one to put a moratorium on it, and then two, the COP26 commitment. So again, I'm just stymied by this, by what's happening. So we should continue digging further. A question from Kenton Clymer. Given Hun Sen's close ties with China, does he attempt to influence China's approach to the Mekong? Any evidence?
I mean, I think this might be one instance where that relationship is like an example of the benefits of that relationship, because you've talked about how China is showing itself more and more willing to work with lower Mekong nations to alleviate downstream wet season droughts by releasing water, even though it's not in their interest. I don't know if Hun Sen has like personally spoken about this, but it's certainly a discussion that the Cambodian government and other MRC Mekong governments seem to be having with with China, or perhaps vice versa. And so I have to think that's, a benefit of that relationship.
Murray Hebert asks, it first comments that, Abby, you talked about some efforts to protect the Tonle Sap inside of Cambodia. Do you see significant support from foreign governments or international NGOs or even local NGOs? Can the Tonle Sap be saved without doing more to protect water levels in the Mekong?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I mean, we have USAID projects, we have a lot of kind of INGOs and NGOs working directly with fishing families to try to help them. I do feel like part of the problem is, you have some very good local environmental groups and environmental activists, but we have seen the government in the last couple of years in particular really going after environmental activism, which is worrying when we're talking about, the lake as a conservation issue, because these are exactly the type of people that would be bringing attention to these matters. There's just been a number of arrests of environmental activists for very, very low-key forms of protest or even just raising awareness about things. I don't think that bodes well. But yeah, we have seen, a number of kind of ad hoc efforts, but in terms of saving the lake, it feels like that has to be happening at a much higher level. So we can do a lot to mitigate the impacts on individuals, which I think is really important and probably the most important, because at the end of the day, we're talking about millions of people who need food, who need support. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, even if the lake is no longer working as it once did. But in terms of, and I would also add, when we say the lake is dying, that it's not like the Aral Sea. I don't think the Tonle Sap is going to disappear. But if it loses that flood pulse, it loses a lot of its biodiversity. It loses a lot of the agriculture around it. It doesn't mean it can't still be a prodigious fishery. But yeah, saving that flood pulse is out of the hands of anyone except, really large scale government efforts and multiple governments working together.
Great. Well, Abby, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and then I've got a personal comment and question to ask you. So this question is going to let me ask my question first, because I think the question from the audience is really great to end on. One thing I loved about your book was how each chapter is a translated Cambodian proverb. And my favorite is where there is money, there are fish. Which you can say in 4 words or 4 syllables in Cambodian, I believe, in Khmer, I believe. What about you, when you were looking for proverbs to translate, which one did you find the most interesting, and how did you tie your research into that proverb?
Oh, it was so fun. I'm gonna pull up this book because I need to give credit where it's due. This book of Khmer sayings was my Bible. So this is translated into English and French and German. And I just went through it and highlighted everything I could find about water. And there's so many proverbs about water. That I think maybe one of the most quintessential is the water rises, fish eat the ants, the water recedes, ants eat the fish. And that is something that there's an artist who did a great exhibit around that a few years ago in Phnom Penh. That's the cycle of life. And let's hope the fish remain and we're not just left with their bones.
Indeed. And I encourage all tuning in to check out the various chapter titles as you read through the book and think through the way that Abby tied these important Khmer proverbs into her findings. So last question, and then we'll wrap up. This comes from Sochita Sim in Phnom Penh. She says, next April 5th, next week, 2022, the Mekong River Commission CEO, Dr. Analak Kitakun, will deliver the first ever State of the Mekong address live. I'm very much looking forward to tuning into Dr. Analak's address. What is one key message from the residents of the lake that you hope that the CEO can speak to and should hear out?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, this is not a theoretical issue this is not a high level technical issue. This is their ability to live and live with dignity. And, you know, this is their livelihood is being just stripped away from before their eyes. I don't want to be like overly rose-colored glasses about what it's like to be a fisher, even in the best of times 30 or 40 years ago. This is not an easy, simple profession, but this is what people rely on. And unless these governments really come together and work in a concerted manner, unless there's, not just a guarantee to stop main stem dams, but a real relooking at tributary dams, unless there's real efforts at enforcement, it's going to affect millions and tens of millions of people across the region, not just in the Tonle Sap Lake, but across the Mekong. And I think he realizes that, and I think the MRC realizes that. I mean, they've been very forthright about what's at stake. So I hope he's just drives that home.
Thank you.
Question. Could I just add, I know there's a lot of outstanding questions. Please feel free to email me personally. I'm asaif@gmail.com. I'm very happy to keep these conversations open.
And perhaps some of those conversations will inspire you to write another book. And we look forward to more books from you in the future. Again, this is a great read. One important thing to mention is it's a fairly brief book. It's not like a 350-page book like I wrote about the Mekong. You can read through Abby Sipes' Troubling the Water in a short read. It's just over 100 pages. It's a great overview of what's happening in the Tonle Sap Lake, the beating heart of the Mekong, and the various challenges that people who have survived and thrived along the lakeside are now struggling through. So I encourage you to find a copy of it at your local bookstore. I do know that it's now in Cambodia for sale. Abby, do you know which bookstore it's available in Cambodia? I saw it on.
I didn't realize. I'm very.
I saw that on Twitter or Facebook that folks are finding it in country. But look around online. You can get an electronic copy as well. It's a great read. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. And we hope that you keep watching and following what's happening in the Mekong, the world's most productive river. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks this whole team, and thank Tita for interpreting. I'm really grateful to have been a part of this. And thank you, audience, for your fantastic